She was 22, and for all intents and purposes, homeless. She had no family to speak of, no clear plan, and just $20 to her name, along with a small, dense hammer wrapped in oilcloth. With one of those dollars, she bought a wrecked buckboard that everyone in Providence Gulch considered firewood. But what nobody knew, what the laughing men and the pitying women could not see, was that welded beneath the broken seat was a secret that would not only change her life, but resurrect the very town that had dismissed her. Della Frost was a child of the high mountain air, born in a mining camp where the only lullaby was the distant rhythmic thunder of a stamp mill. Her father, Marcus Frost, was a man who chased ambition down from the peaks and into the city, taking his family to a tidy house in Denver where the air was thick with the scent of money and social climbing. Her mother, Eleanor, embraced this new world, trading her sturdy mountain boots for delicate slippers and her practicality for the fragile currency of reputation. But Della never quite left the mountains behind. They lived inside her, a quiet landscape of stone and pine that the city could not pave over. Her true home had never been a house, but a place of fire and iron, the smithy of her maternal grandfather, Elias Thorne. Elias was a man forged from the same elements as his trade, solid, quiet, and possessed of a heat that could shape the most stubborn material into something of use and beauty. He saw the same substance in his granddaughter. While her parents despaired of her skinned knees and the smudge of grease on her cheek, Elias saw a steady hand and a patient eye. In the singing heat of his forge, he taught her the language of metal, not just the brute force of the sledge, but the careful art of listening to the steel. He taught her how to read the cherry-red glow that signaled the perfect moment for shaping, how to interpret the subtle ring of a hammer strike, and how to spot a hairline fracture that could spell disaster. He gave her a small hammer he had forged himself, the head a perfect polished weight of tempered steel, the handle of fire-hardened hickory shaped precisely to her grip. It was not a toy, but a tool, and in his giving it, he acknowledged her as a fellow craftswoman. "Look at the work, not the worker," he would say, his voice a low rumble beneath the hiss of the quenching tub. "Good work speaks for itself. It lasts." He taught her that everything, a hinge, a wheel, a life, was a matter of stresses and supports, and that understanding how things were built was the only way to understand why they broke. When Elias died, the fire in the forge went out, and with it, the only real warmth in Della's life. Her parents sold the smithy, its anvils and tongs scattered to strangers, and the last echo of her grandfather's hammer faded into the silence of a Denver parlor. Life in Denver was a lesson in suffocation. Della was enrolled in a ladies' academy where she was taught posture, piano, and the art of saying nothing of substance. Her hands, accustomed to the reassuring heft of wood and iron, fumbled with delicate teacups and embroidery needles. Her mind, trained to solve practical problems of leverage and balance, rebelled against the abstract rules of social etiquette. Her father, now a banker, regarded her with a growing sense of despair. Her quiet competence, her direct gaze, her lack of feminine artifice, they were a constant, mortifying reminder of the mountain origins he was so desperate to erase. He saw her as a piece of unrefined ore in a world that valued only the polished and gilded. For Della, the city was a place of profound uselessness. She watched as men in fine suits made fortunes from paper promises, while the tangible, honest world of making and mending seemed a distant dream. She felt like a tool left to rust in a velvet-lined box, her purpose forgotten, her edges growing dull. She carried her grandfather's hammer with her, wrapped in a linen cloth at the bottom of her trunk, a secret anchor to a world where she had made sense. The paper promises her father dealt in were as brittle as glass. His ambition had always outpaced his caution, and in the panic of a market downturn, his speculations shattered. The collapse was not a sudden, dramatic explosion, but a slow, silent crumbling. First the whispers, then the closed doors, then the polite but firm refusal of credit. The Frost family's gilded cage dissolved around them. The house on the tidy street was sold, its contents auctioned off to strangers who handled their possessions with cold, appraising eyes. They moved to a series of progressively smaller, shabbier rented rooms, each one a step down into a quiet, well-mannered hell. Marcus Frost, who had once commanded boardrooms, now struggled to meet the gaze of his landlord. Eleanor, who had presided over elegant teas, now grew gaunt and silent. Her world shrunk to the four walls of their latest failure. Through it all, Della was a quiet, observant presence. She did not weep or rage. She saw the mechanics of the collapse with the clear, dispassionate eye her grandfather had taught her. She saw the flawed design, the unsustainable stress, the inevitable fracture. Her parents' life had been built on a poor foundation, and now it was paying the price. But her practicality was no comfort to them. It was an indictment. She was the living proof of a world they had abandoned, a world of substance and resilience they now desperately needed and could no longer access. In the end, they could not bear the sight of her. The ejection, when it came, was not a heated argument or a tearful farewell. It was a simple, brutal transaction conducted in the gray morning light of a cramped boarding house room that smelled of dust and despair. Her father, looking older and smaller than she had ever seen him, sat at a Ricca Simply table. He did not look at her as he pushed a folded piece of paper and a few worn bills across the scarred wood. "There is a train for the Western Slope at noon," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "This will take you as far as Providence Gulch." He named a town from his past, a place he had not seen in 2 decades. "I have written to a distant cousin. They will see to you." It was a lie, and they both knew it. There was no cousin. There was only the raw, undeniable fact that her presence was a weight he could no longer carry. He was casting her off, not into a new life, but simply away from his own. He was a broken man, and he could not stand to be witnessed by the one person in his family who was not. Della looked at the ticket, then at the $20. It was a pittance, the last dregs of a vanished fortune, but it was also a severance. She did not plead or question. To do so would have been to participate in the fiction that this was anything other than an abandonment. She saw the hollows under her father's eyes, the tremor in his hand as he lit a cheap cigarillo. She saw her mother standing by the window, her back to the room, a statue of denial. In that moment, Della felt a cold, clean pang of something like pity, but it was distant, like watching a structure collapse from a safe hill. They were strangers to her, and she to them. She simply nodded. "All right," she said. The word was not one of agreement, but of acknowledgement. A fact had been stated, and she was accepting it. She went to her small trunk, the only piece of furniture that was truly hers, and packed a canvas satchel. A change of clothes, a bar of soap, a brush, and, from the very bottom, the oilcloth-wrapped weight of her grandfather's hammer. She secured it in the center of the bag, its familiar density a small, solid point in a world that had become fluid and uncertain. When she was ready, she walked to the door. Her father still did not look up. Her mother did not turn. Della did not say goodbye. She simply opened the door, stepped into the hallway, and closed it quietly behind her. The soft click of the latch, the final, understated sound of her old life ending. The journey was a rumbling, clattering passage from one world to another. The train pulled out of Denver, leaving the grid of manicured streets and desperate ambitions behind, and began its long, slow climb into the mountains. Della sat on a hard wooden bench, her satchel on her lap, and watched the landscape transform. The flat brown plains gave way to rolling foothills dotted with scrub oak, which in turn surrendered to the deep green of pine and fir as the train chugged its way up the winding grade. The air grew thinner, cleaner, smelling of pine needles and cold stone. It was a smell that unlocked a part of her she had thought long buried, the scent of her grandfather's mountain and the clear, uncomplicated purpose of his forge. The other passengers in the car were a mix of prospectors with wild eyes, merchants with weary ones, and families heading towards some new, uncertain hope. No one spoke to her, and she was grateful for the silence. It allowed her to observe, to feel the rhythm of the steel wheels on the track, the sway of the car, the slow, inexorable pull of gravity as they ascended. She arrived in Providence Gulch as the sun was dipping behind the jagged peaks, casting long purple shadows across the valley. The town was little more than a single wide street carved out of the mountainside, a collection of unpainted, false-fronted buildings huddled together as if for warmth against the vast, indifferent wilderness. A cold wind swept down from the pass, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the faint, metallic tang of an old mine. There was no cousin waiting for her, of course. There was only the raw, unvarnished reality of a town clinging to the edge of existence. With a calm that felt less like courage and more like simple necessity, Della shouldered her satchel and walked the length of the street. Her eyes, trained to assess structure and wear, took in every detail. The sagging porch of the general store, the fresh paint on the saloon, the shuttered windows of the assayer's office. She found a boarding house run by a woman with a face as weathered as the surrounding mountains, a Mrs. Gable. The room she was given was small and spare, containing only a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out onto a back alley. It was clean. It cost $5 for the week, paid in advance. Della handed over one of the crisp bills, her fortune now reduced to $15 and a handful of change. That night, lying in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sigh of the wind in the pines, the full weight of her solitude finally settled upon her. She was alone, with dwindling funds and no prospects. Yet, as she drifted to sleep, one hand resting on the satchel that held her grandfather's hammer, she did not feel fear. She felt a strange, quiet readiness. The world had stripped her down to her foundation, and she was about to find out how strong it was. The first days in Providence Gulch were a quiet education in rejection. Della rose each morning, washed her face in cold water from the basin, and went in search of work. She was methodical. She asked for washing and mending at the boarding house, but Mrs. Gable did her own. She inquired about clerking at the mercantile, but the owner, a pinched man named Abernathy, shook his head, his eyes lingering on her calloused hands. "Not looking for help," he said, though she had seen his son struggling to unload a wagon just that morning. She offered to sweep out the saloon, to muck stalls at the livery, to cook for the miners. The answers were always the same: a polite but firm no, an amused shake of the head. A door closed gently in her face. They saw a young woman, alone and adrift, and their assumptions were a wall she could not seem to breach. She was an object of pity or suspicion, a problem they did not want to take on. Her practicality was invisible to them. They saw only her vulnerability. With each refusal, her money dwindled. $10, $9, $8. She began to walk, not to search for work anymore, but simply to move, to fight off the cold paralysis of despair. Her walks took her to the edges of the town, past the last houses and up the paths that led into the hills. On the west end of town, past the livery stable run by a burly Irishman named Finn O'Malley, was a sprawling junk pile, a graveyard for the town's broken things. Wrecked wagons, rusted tools, shattered crockery, and splintered furniture lay in a chaotic heap. To the townspeople, it was an eyesore. To Della, it was an encyclopedia of failure. She could trace the story of each object: the cracked axle from a wagon that took a corner too fast, the snapped handle of a shovel that met a rock it could not move. One afternoon, half hidden behind a pile of rotting timbers, she saw it. It was the wreck of a buckboard, and it was in a terrible state. One of the rear wheels was a starburst of splintered spokes. The axle beneath it bent into a sad, useless curve. The seat was torn, its horsehair stuffing spilling out like entrails, and the wooden bed was cracked in several places. It had clearly been in a serious accident, likely on the treacherous pass above the town, and had been dragged here to be forgotten. Others saw firewood and scrap. Della saw something else. She walked around it, her eyes tracing the lines of its construction. The frame was solid oak, weathered but not rotten. The iron fittings, though rusted, were heavy and well forged. She ran her hand over the bent axle, the cold iron familiar under her palm. She could feel the memory of her grandfather's forge in its very grain. He had taught her that a bend was not a break. He had taught her that good material, even when damaged, held its integrity. She knelt and looked closer, her gaze sharp and analytical. The joinery was sound, the basic structure intact. In her mind, she began to dismantle and rebuild it, seeing not a wreck, but a collection of salvageable parts, a puzzle waiting to be solved. A plan, small and fragile, began to form. She walked to the livery, where Finn O'Malley was shoeing a horse. The town boys who loitered there snickered as she approached. "What do you want for the buckboard?" she asked, her voice even. O'Malley paused, hammer in hand, and looked at her as if she'd lost her mind. "That piece of junk?" he laughed. "It's yours for the hauling." "I'll give you $1 for it," Della said. The price was not for the wood or the iron, it was for the dignity of a clean transaction. The laughter from the boys grew louder. "She's going to pay for firewood," one of them crowed. O'Malley studied her for a long moment, a flicker of something, pity, curiosity, perhaps respect, in his eyes. He wiped his hand on his leather apron and extended it. $1 it is, lass," he said, his voice suddenly serious. She placed one of her last precious coins in his palm. The deal was done. The town had a new fool, and Della Frost had a purpose. The work was slow and arduous. Della had no mule, no wagon, only her own strength and the simple principles of leverage her grandfather had taught her. She spent the next 2 days dragging the pieces of the buckboard from the town's junk pile to a small, sheltered clearing behind the livery stable, a spot O'Malley had grudgingly allowed her to use. She moved the larger frame by using a long plank as a lever, inching it forward a few feet at a time. The wheels, even the broken one, she rolled. The smaller pieces she carried. The town watched with amusement. The men on the porch of the mercantile made jokes. The women whispered behind their hands. They saw a desperate girl engaged in a pointless, back-breaking folly. They did not see the quiet, methodical focus in her eyes. They did not see the work. Once all the pieces were gathered, she began the real task: dismantling. This was not destruction, but a careful deconstruction, an autopsy to understand the nature of the wreck and the potential for rebirth. With a few borrowed tools, a wrench from O'Malley, a pry bar she'd found in the junk pile, she started to take the buckboard apart. Every bolt was rusted, every nut frozen in place. She used what little she had, tapping with her hammer to break the rust's seal, using her whole body to turn a stubborn bolt. She saved everything, every nut, every bolt, every bracket and brace, laying them out in neat rows on a piece of canvas. She was a surgeon, and this was her operating theater. As she worked, she learned the buckboard's history. The deep gouges in the frame spoke of a violent crash, a sudden stop against rock. The bent axle told a story of immense force. Finally, she came to the driver's seat. It was unusually heavy, far heavier than a simple plank and cushion should be. The leather was rotted and torn, the horsehair stuffing damp and matted. As she worked to unbolt it from the frame, she noticed something strange. The underside was not just a single wooden plank. A thick sheet of iron, about a foot square, had been bolted over the center. The bolt heads were common, but their ends had been peened over, flattened with a hammer to make them difficult to remove. A crude repair, she thought at first. But then she looked closer. Her eyes, trained in the forge, saw what no one else would have. Running along the edge of the iron plate, almost hidden by rust and grime, was a thick, clumsy, unmistakable bead of a weld. It wasn't a neat smith's weld. It was a desperate farmer's weld, made with more heat than skill. This was not a patch. It was a seal. A secret. A thrill, cold and sharp, went through her. She set aside the wrench and picked up her own hammer, its weight a familiar comfort in her hand. Using the sharpened end of the pry bar as a makeshift cold chisel, she placed the tip against the rough edge of the weld and struck it firmly. The sound, a sharp tink, was absorbed by the heavy iron. Again and again she struck, moving the chisel along the seam, her blows steady and precise. It was her grandfather's work, in reverse, not joining but parting. The sun moved across the sky. Her arm began to ache, but she did not stop. After what felt like hours, a section of the weld gave way with a grating crack. She worked the pry bar into the opening and leaned on it with all her weight. The metal groaned in protest, and then, with a final, shuddering pop, the plate broke free. It fell to the ground with a heavy thud. Nestled in a shallow, hand-carved hollow in the wood beneath was a small, heavy iron box, its surface pitted with rust. Beside it, wrapped carefully in a sheet of oilcloth, was a packet of papers. Her heart pounding, she reached for the papers first. She unwrapped the oilcloth with trembling fingers. Inside were a dozen folded sheets, assay reports. Each one detailed a sample taken from the North Star mine, the big claim on the mountain above town that everyone said had been played out for a year. The reports, signed by a man named Silas Kane, showed staggering concentrations of gold and silver ore. They were dated just over a year ago. Tucked into the last report was a small, hastily scrawled note. The handwriting was shaky. "They ran me off, said the vein was pinched. Liars. The North Star is richer than ever. This is for whoever finds it. My name was Silas Kane. I was an honest man." She then turned to the box. The lock was simple, and she broke it with a single sharp blow from the pry bar. Inside, there was no glint of coins. Instead, the box was filled to the brim with small, heavy leather pouches. She opened one. It was full of a coarse, glittering yellow powder. Gold dust. Silas Kane's last hidden payment. In her hands, she held it all. The map, the proof, and the capital to bring a dead mine and a forgotten man's legacy back to life. The discovery settled a profound calm over Della. The gold dust was not a treasure to be spent. It was capital to be invested. The assay reports were not a windfall. They were a blueprint for work. The ghost of Silas Kane had not left her a fortune, but a responsibility. Her first move was one of careful verification. She took one of the smaller, less detailed reports, and a tiny, almost imperceptible pinch of the gold dust, wrapping it in a twist of paper. She walked not to the main assayer's office, which was shuttered, but to a small shack on the edge of town where an old man named Jedediah Stone lived. He was a retired prospector who had forgotten more about ore than most men ever knew. She found him sitting on his porch, carving a piece of wood. Without a word, she handed him the paper and the twist of dust. He squinted at the dust in his palm, then touched a bit to his tongue. He unfolded the report, his eyes scanning the columns of figures. A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the whisper of the wind. Finally, he looked up, his gaze sharp and penetrating, not at the paper, but at her. "Silas Kane," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble. He was a good man, a geologist, not just a pick-and-shovel man. Knew his rock. The company men from Denver said his claim was a bust. Ran him out of town on a rail of lies. He looked from Della's face to the high peaks looming over the town. He always said the North Star had another pocket. Looks like he found it. He handed the report back to her. This dust is high grade, and this paper is proof. That was all the confirmation she needed. Her next stop was the county records office, a dusty room in the back of the Mercantile. The clerk, the same man who had refused her work, looked at her with bored indifference. She asked to see the claim map for the North Star mine. He grunted and pulled out a large, rolled canvas. The claim was marked abandoned. Following the procedure Silas Kane's note had indirectly laid out, Della paid the $5 filing fee from her precious gold dust, weighed out on Mr. Abernathy's own scales. She filed a new claim on the North Star, in the name of Della Frost. The clerk stamped the papers with a profound lack of interest. The North Star was hers. That afternoon, she turned her capital into tools. At Abernathy's Mercantile, she did not haggle. She chose with a clear, practical eye 2 new pickaxes with hickory handles, 3 round-point shovels, a coil of good hemp rope, 2 lanterns, a 5-gallon can of oil, and a dozen candles. She paid for it all with the glittering dust, weighing it out herself on the counter scale, her hand steady. Mr. Abernathy watched, his pinched face a mask of confusion and dawning avarice. The final piece of her plan was labor. She knew she couldn't work the mine alone. That evening, she went to the saloon. In a corner, drinking cheap whiskey and nursing their misfortune, were 2 brothers, Tom and Ben Carter. They were good miners who had been laid off when the last working vein in the area had petered out. They were planning to leave town the next day. She walked straight to their table. "I have a claim on the North Star," she said, her voice clear and low, not carrying to the rest of the room. "And I have assay reports that say it's still rich. I need men who aren't afraid of hard work. I can't promise you a share, not yet, but I can pay you a fair daily wage in gold." They looked at her, then at each other, skepticism warring with desperation in their eyes. Tom, the older brother, finally spoke. "Show us the dust." Della opened her hand and showed them a small nugget she had taken from one of the pouches. It was enough. "We start at sunrise," she said. The rebuilding had begun. Word spread through Providence Gulch like a grass fire. The girl who had hauled a broken buckboard through the street was now marching up the mountain every morning with the Carter brothers in tow. At first, the town was merely curious. Then, the source of the rumor reached the company men in Denver who had bought out Silas Kane's partners and declared the North Star worthless. They had acquired the claim for pennies on the dollar, a strategic move to consolidate their holdings, never believing it held any real value. The news that a lone woman was now working their barren rock was an irritation, then an alarm. They sent an agent, a slick man in a city suit named Harris, to handle the situation. Harris arrived on the afternoon stage, expecting to intimidate a foolish girl. He found Della at the mine entrance, her face smudged with dirt, her hands wrapped around a shovel handle. He blustered about legal ownership and prior claims. It was then that the first threads of community began to weave themselves around Della. Jedediah Stone appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, walking up the trail with his prospecting hammer in hand. "The claim was legally abandoned, Harris," Jedediah said, his voice carrying the weight of undisputed local authority. "And Miss Frost's filing is rock solid. I saw it myself, just like I saw the assay reports you and your company buried." Harris, faced with the town's most respected elder, found his threats turning to smoke. He retreated down the mountain, vowing legal action that never came. The encounter solidified Della's position. She was no longer an outsider, she was a contender. The work in the mine was brutal, but rewarding. Following the meticulous notes left by Silas Kane, Della and the Carter brothers bypassed the collapsed and barren shafts. They cleared a secondary entrance Kane had started, and within a week, they hit the vein he had described. It was a ribbon of quartz, shot through with the unmistakable gleam of gold and the dark, heavy luster of silver ore. It was richer than any of them had ever seen. The first load of ore they brought down the mountain was a spectacle. They used a borrowed sledge, and the whole town seemed to turn out to watch them haul it to the stamp mill. The mill, silent for almost a year, was fired up at Della's expense. The rhythmic, earth-shaking thump, thump, thump of the stamps crushing her ore was the sound of a heartbeat returning to Providence Gulch. That sound was a proclamation of success. Finn O'Malley, who had sold her the buckboard, approached her not with a laugh, but with an offer. "You'll be needing a proper mule team to haul that ore, Miss Frost. I'll give you a fair rate." Mrs. Gable, her landlady, began packing a substantial lunch for her every morning, refusing any payment. "A working woman needs her strength," she'd say simply. People on the street no longer looked at her with pity. They greeted her by name. "Morning, Miss Frost." With the profits from the first smelting, she paid Tom and Ben a handsome bonus and put them on as full-time foremen. She invested in new timbers to make the North Star safe, bought a team of strong mules from O'Malley, and commissioned the town's carpenter to build 2 new, sturdy ore wagons. And in the evenings, after long days at the mine, she worked on her first project. Piece by piece, she began to restore the wrecked buckboard. She straightened the frame, replaced the splintered boards, and commissioned the blacksmith to forge a new axle and repair the broken wheel. She bought new leather and taught herself to stitch a new seat cover. When it was finished, it was not a fancy carriage, but a strong, plain, functional vehicle. She painted it a simple, dark green, and on the side, in clean white letters, she painted a name, the Silas. It was not a monument to her success, but a quiet, constant reminder of its foundation. A year passed, then another. The North Star Mine became the lifeblood of Providence Gulch. Its steady production brought new prosperity to the town. The mercantile expanded, the saloon hired a piano player, and new families began to arrive, drawn by the promise of steady work. Della Frost was no longer just a mine owner. She was the quiet center of the town's revival. She built a small, solid cabin for herself on a plot of land overlooking the town, not far from the livery. It was simple and well-made, with a stone fireplace and shelves for the few books she had acquired. From her porch, she could see the lights of the town she had, in her own way, helped to rebuild. One cool evening in late autumn, she stood at the entrance to the North Star. The day's work was done, and the Carter brothers were leading the last mule team down the mountain. The air was crisp with the promise of snow, and the setting sun painted the peaks in hues of orange and deep violet. In her right hand, she held the small hammer her grandfather had made for her. Its weight was a familiar comfort, a solid connection to the man who had taught her to see the truth in things, to value substance over surface. She ran her thumb over the smooth, fire-hardened hickory of the handle, a silent communion with his memory. He had taught her to look at the work, and the work was all around her, in the safely timbered mine shaft, in the prosperous town glowing below, in the very ground beneath her feet. Her thoughts turned to Silas Kane, the honest geologist she had never met, but to whom she owed everything. His legacy was not just the gold and silver pulled from the earth, but the quiet act of defiance he had welded into a broken-down buckboard. Down at her cabin, the Silas was parked, its green paint catching the last of the light. It was her preferred vehicle for trips to town, a constant mobile reminder that what one person discards, another can rebuild into a foundation. She thought, for a fleeting moment, of her parents. She had received a letter, forwarded from Denver, from a distant acquaintance. It spoke of her father's passing and her mother's reduced circumstances. With her first significant profits, Della had sent a bank draft to a lawyer in Denver with instructions to settle her father's most pressing debts and provide a small, anonymous stipend for her mother. It was not an act of forgiveness or even of love, but of a different kind of duty. It was the balancing of a ledger, a structural repair to the family name, a practical solution. She had closed a door, quietly and firmly, just as one had been closed on her. Her gaze drifted from the high, lonely peaks to the warm, clustered lights of Providence Gulch. She was not just a resident here. She was part of its fabric, woven into its story as surely as the gold was woven into the quartz. She was Miss Frost, who had arrived with nothing but $20 and a strange attachment to a broken wagon. Della Frost, who had bought a pile of firewood for $1. She smiled, a small, private expression. It was, without question, the best dollar she had ever spent. It had not bought a mine, not really. It had bought her a home. She was 21, and by the cold measure of the world, she was homeless. Her uncle, Silas Blackwood, a man who measured everything in columns of figures, had declared her a debt, and for that, she was dismissed. She had no family left to turn to, no plan, and just $10 in a worn leather purse. And with 4 of those dollars, she would soon buy a locked and abandoned railroad car sitting on a dead-end siding in the Wyoming high country. It was a purchase of quiet desperation, a foolish grasp at owning something, anything at all. But what no one knew, what she could not possibly imagine, was that sealed inside that rusted iron box was a 30-year-old secret, a payroll, and a leather-bound ledger that held the truth about the man who had cast her out. A truth that would not just change her life, but resurrect a town left for dead. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Nell Ashby. If you're watching from a place that feels forgotten, let us know in the comments below. Nell's education had come not in a schoolhouse, but in the ringing darkness of her father's smithy. John Ashby had been a railroad blacksmith, a man whose language was the color of hot steel and the percussive grammar of a hammer on an anvil. He had loved 2 things without reservation: his daughter and the elegant physics of his work. From the time she was old enough to stand near the forge without flinching, he had taught her. He taught her the names of tools not as a list to be memorized, but as a litany of purpose. The ball peen for riveting, the cross peen for drawing out, the straight peen for stretching. He taught her to read the temper of metal in its shades of straw yellow, peacock blue, and dove gray. "Everything has a grain, Nell," he would say, his voice a low rumble beneath the hiss of the slack tub. "Wood, steel, even people. You learn to work with it, not against it, and it will bend to your will. Fight it, and it will break, or it will break you." She learned the heft and balance of his favorite hammer, a small 2-pound cross peen with a hickory handle worn smooth and dark by the sweat and oil of his hand. It was an extension of him, and in her small hands, it felt like holding his strength. When she was 17, a sickness of the lungs that the doctor called consumption took her father quickly, leaving the forge cold and silent. Her uncle, Silas Blackwood, her father's estranged older brother, arrived from his prosperous town of Blackwood Station to handle the arrangements. Silas was the inverse of his brother. Where John had been forged of iron and soot, Silas was constructed of paper and ink. He was a banker, a founder, a man who had built his town on land acquired through shrewd, unsmiling transactions. He saw his brother's forge not as a place of craft, but as a poorly performing asset. He sold it, along with the house and tools, for a sum that seemed insultingly small to Nell. He then took her in, not with warmth, but with the air of a man accepting a necessary, if inconvenient, inheritance. For 4 years, she lived in his large, quiet house, a ghost in the halls of his prosperity. She was given chores, a small room, and a seat at the dinner table where the conversation was always of ledgers, interest rates, and freight costs. Silas never spoke of her father, and when Nell once brought him up, her uncle had simply looked at her with his cool, gray eyes and said, "Your father did not understand the world as it is, Nell. He saw value in sentiment. There is no column for that in a balance sheet." In those 4 years, the only thing she had left of her father was the small cross-peen hammer, which she had wrapped in oilcloth and hidden at the bottom of her trunk. It was the one piece of him Silas had overlooked, a thing of no monetary value, an object whose only worth was in sentiment. The end of her time in Blackwood Station came as quietly as it had begun. On the morning of her 21st birthday, her uncle did not wish her well. Instead, he summoned her to his office, a room that smelled of dry paper and leather-bound books. He sat behind his wide oak desk, a sheaf of papers squared perfectly before him. He did not ask her to sit. "Nell," he began, his voice flat and administrative, "you have reached the age of majority. As such, the matter of your keep must be settled." He slid a single sheet of paper across the polished wood. It was an invoice. He had calculated the cost of her food, her lodging, her clothing for 4 years, down to the penny. The total was a staggering sum, more money than she had ever seen or imagined. "This is what your maintenance has cost my household," he said. She stared at the number, feeling the air leave her lungs. It was a debt she could never repay. It was a cage made of ink. "However," he continued, steepling his fingers, "I am not an unreasonable man. I am prepared to forgive this debt in its entirety. In exchange, you will accept a train ticket to any destination west of here and a stipend of $10 for your relocation." He pushed a ticket and 2 $5 bills next to the invoice. It was not an offer. It was a verdict. There was no room for argument, no space for appeal. She had been a line item in his ledger, and he was now closing the account. She looked at his face, as smooth and unreadable as a river stone, and saw no flicker of family, no memory of his brother. She simply saw a man balancing his books. "I understand," she said, her voice steady. She took the ticket and the money. She did not take the invoice. She left it lying on the desk, a testament to his particular brand of cruelty. She went to her room, packed her small trunk with her few dresses, her mother's locket, and at the very bottom, wrapped in its oilcloth, her father's hammer. An hour later, she was standing on the platform of the Blackwood Station depot, the whistle of the westbound train screaming its arrival. She did not look back at the town that bore her uncle's name. She simply gathered her things and moved toward her new life, a life that began with a debt she did not owe and $10 she had not earned. The journey was a lesson in diminishment. The train pulled out of Blackwood Station, a place of painted clapboard, tidy streets, and the palpable hum of commerce, all of it a monument to Silas Blackwood's ambition. Nell sat on the hard wooden bench of the passenger car, her trunk at her feet, and watched the world she knew recede. For the first hour, the landscape was one of managed prosperity, fenced pastures, herds of fat cattle, and neat farmhouses with smoke curling from their chimneys. But as the train chugged westward, the land began to change. The green softened to pale ochre, the rolling hills flattened into an immense high plain, and the trees grew sparse, clinging to the dry creek beds like stubborn afterthoughts. The air that came through the open window was no longer sweet with hay and damp earth, but thin, dry, and scented with sage and dust. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the rails was a constant, hypnotic drumbeat, marking her passage from a place of cold comfort to one of absolute uncertainty. She was moving not just across a landscape, but through the strata of fortune. The other passengers thinned out at each stop, leaving for small homesteads or dusty cattle towns until the car was nearly empty. By the second day, the train was a small, loud thing moving through a vast and silent emptiness. The sky was immense, a pale, washed-out blue that seemed to press down on the land. In the distance, the sharp, purple teeth of the mountains serrated the horizon, a destination that felt impossibly far. Her ticket was for a town called Rawlins, but a conversation overheard between the conductor and a brakeman had caught her ear. They spoke of a siding called Caldera Spur, a place where the railroad was auctioning off abandoned stock and equipment. Selling it for scrap, the conductor had said with a shrug. The spur's been dead for 20 years. Cheaper to sell it than to haul it out. An idea, fragile and uncertain, began to form in Nell's mind. Owning something, even if it was just scrap. When the train slowed for a water stop at a desolate junction, a place with no name but a water tower and a telegraph shed, she made her decision. She found the conductor. "I'd like to get off at Caldera Spur," she said. He looked at her, then at her simple dress and small trunk, his expression a mixture of pity and disbelief. "Ain't nothing there, miss. Nothing at all." "I'm aware," Nell said. "I'm meeting someone." It was a lie, but it was enough. He shrugged and pulled the signal cord. The train groaned to a halt beside a short, weed-choked siding. A weathered sign, its letters peeling, read, "Caldera Spur." There was no station, no platform, just two long, rusted tracks branching off from the main line and disappearing into the sagebrush. The brakeman swung her trunk down onto the dusty ground. The train hissed, groaned, and began to pull away, leaving her utterly alone in the immense silence of the high plains, with the wind pulling at her hair and the sun beating down on her head. Caldera Spur was not a ghost town. It was the ghost of a town's ambition. All that remained were a dozen sun-bleached structures huddled together as if for warmth against the ceaseless wind. A failed general store with boarded-up windows, a livery stable whose roof had collapsed into a skeleton of rafters, and a handful of small, salt-box houses slowly surrendering to the elements. The spur line itself ran past these buildings to a flat, dusty yard where the auction was taking place. A small crowd of perhaps 20 men, ranchers and scavengers with sun-cracked faces and wary eyes, stood listening to a tired-looking auctioneer in a sweat-stained hat. He was gesturing to a pile of rusted rails and splintered ties. "Sold for $3.50 to the man in the blue shirt," he called out, his voice thin in the open air. Nell walked toward the group, her trunk held in one hand, feeling the weight of their collective gaze. She was an anomaly, a young woman alone in a place of men and decay. She ignored them, her attention drawn to the items for sale. There were flat cars loaded with rotting lumber, a tender car stripped of its brass fittings, and at the very end of the line, a single, hulking boxcar. It was a Class B-40 baggage car, built of heavy oak and reinforced with thick iron plating. Its paint, once a proud crimson of the Wyoming and Pacific line, had faded to a mottled, rust-colored blush. Unlike the other cars, this one was sealed. Its heavy sliding door was not just locked, but riveted shut, with a thick, ugly weld bead running along the seam where the door met the frame. It sat there like a locked strongbox, inscrutable and immense. A piece of paper, brittle and yellowed, was tacked to the wood beside the door. It was the auction lot description. "Lot 73, she read. 1 Class B-40 boxcar. Contents unknown. Sold as is, where is. Buyer responsible for removal." The auctioneer moved down the line, his patter growing more desperate as he tried to sell off the dregs of the railroad's forgotten property. When he reached the boxcar, he barely gave it a glance. "All right, folks, Lot 73, one sealed baggage car. We don't know what's in it. Probably 30 years of dust and spiders. We can't open it, and we ain't gonna try. We'll start the bidding at $5 for the scrap iron." Silence. The men looked at the car, then at each other, and shook their heads. The cost of cutting it open and hauling it away would be more than the scrap was worth. $5, gentlemen? $4 for the iron?" The auctioneer's gaze swept the small crowd and landed on Nell. He seemed about to move on, but she raised her hand, a small, hesitant gesture. "I'll bid $4, she said, her voice clear and steady. A few of the men chuckled. The auctioneer's eyebrows went up. $4 from the young lady. Do I hear 4 1/4? $4 once, twice. Sold. For $4 to the lady in the gray dress." He banged a small gavel on a railway tie. He looked at her, a wry smile on his face. "Congratulations, miss. She's all yours. Just as soon as you figure out how to move her." He laughed, and the other men joined in. Nell ignored them. She walked to the auctioneer's table, opened her purse, and counted out 4 of her 10 remaining dollars. She took the bill of sale, a simple, handwritten receipt. She was now the owner of a locked iron box she couldn't open, in a town that didn't exist, with $6 to her name. She walked back to the car, laid her hand against the sun-warmed, rusted metal, and felt the first, terrifying thrill of ownership. The first challenge was not opening the car, but surviving long enough to try. The wind grew colder as the sun dipped toward the mountains, and Nell knew she could not spend the night in the open. She explored the derelict town, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She found one building that was more intact than the others, a small boarding house with a sign that read, "The Caldera Rest." Most of its windows were broken, but one room at the back was weather-tight, its glass still in place. Inside, there was a simple iron bed frame, a rickety table, and a small wood stove, its pipe rusted but whole. This would be her shelter. Her second discovery was a well behind the house with a functioning hand pump. The water that came up was cold and sweet, tasting of iron and deep earth. With water and shelter secured, her focus returned to the boxcar. She walked its length, studying the problem. The door was sealed by a thick, crude weld, a bead of iron laid down 30 years ago by a hand that had clearly intended it to be permanent. Beneath the weld, she could see the heads of heavy rivets. To open it would require tools she did not have: a heavy sledge, a cold chisel, and a great deal of time. Her father's hammer was a fine tool for shaping, but it was no brute instrument of destruction. She spent the next day scavenging. In the collapsed livery stable under a pile of rotted hay, she found a set of rusted but serviceable tongs and a cracked anvil head. In the abandoned general store, she found a barrel of coal, dusty but still combustible. She was gathering the components of a forge. That evening, a man approached her small, makeshift camp. He was old, with a back bent from a lifetime of labor and hands like gnarled oak. He introduced himself as Jedediah, a retired Gandhi dancer who had worked the original line and now lived alone in one of the few other habitable shacks, surviving on a small railroad pension and his own resilience. "Saw you at the auction," he said, his voice raspy. "Bought yourself a puzzle." "I did," Nell replied, not wasting words. "You aim to open it?" "I do." He watched her for a long moment, his pale blue eyes taking in her meager setup, the small hammer she was cleaning by the fire, the determination in her posture. "You'll need more than that little pecker," he said, gesturing to her father's hammer. "You need a striking hammer and a good chisel." He saw the flicker of disappointment in her eyes. She had no money to buy such things, and no one to borrow from. He chewed on his lip, then seemed to come to a decision. "I got a sledge and a set of hardies and chisels. Belonged to the crew boss. Left 'em when the spur closed." He paused. "You can use them, if you'll share whatever's in that boxcar, if it's anything more than spiders." It was a fair offer, a partnership born of mutual necessity. "Agreed," Nell said. The next morning, Jedediah returned with a 12-pound sledgehammer, its handle smooth with age, and a canvas roll that held a series of heavy, tempered steel chisels. The work began. Nell knew from her father that she couldn't simply smash her way in. She needed to attack the weld. Using the tongs and her makeshift forge, she heated a chisel to a bright cherry red, then used her father's hammer to refine its edge, giving it the perfect angle to bite into the old weld. It was work her father had taught her, the careful marriage of heat and force. Jedediah watched, his initial skepticism turning to quiet respect. "You've held a hammer before?" he observed. "My father was a blacksmith," she said, not looking up from her work. For 3 days they labored. Jedediah, his old muscles protesting, would swing the heavy sledge, driving the chisel that Nell held steady against the weld. The sound was a deafening, rhythmic clang that echoed across the empty plains. Clang. A chip of rust flew. Clang. A small groove appeared. Clang. It was brutal, exhausting work. Each evening they would stop, their bodies aching, and Nell would repair the blunted edge of the chisel at her forge. On the 4th day, with a final resonant blow from the sledge, the weld bead cracked. A line of darkness appeared. With a pry bar they'd found, they wedged it into the crack and heaved. The metal groaned, screeched, and then, with a shudder that ran through the whole car, the door broke free. The door slid open with the shriek of tortured metal, revealing a rectangle of absolute darkness. A wave of air, stale and dead for 3 decades, washed over them. It smelled of dry rot, dust, and something else. A faint, metallic tang. They let the interior air out for a long while before Jedediah lit a lantern. He held it high, and they peered inside. The light cut through the gloom, illuminating a scene frozen in time. The car was not empty. It was filled with wooden crates, neatly stacked and bound with iron straps. But their attention was immediately drawn to the center of the car. There, bolted to the floor, was a large iron strongbox, about 3 feet square, its surface covered in a fine layer of dust. And beside it, lying on its side, was the skeleton of a man. He was dressed in the tattered remains of a railroad paymaster's uniform. One skeletal hand rested on the strongbox, as if in a final protective gesture. "Lord have mercy," Jedediah whispered, taking off his hat. They stood in silence for a moment, paying their respects to the unknown man who had been sealed in this tomb. Nell's gaze was methodical. She noted the heavy-duty lock on the strongbox, and then something else. Near the dead man's other hand was a small leather-bound book, almost lost in the shadows. A ledger. She stepped carefully into the car, her boots stirring up clouds of dust that danced in the lantern light. She picked up the book. Its cover was stiff, the leather dry and cracked. She opened it. The first page was a paymaster's log, the entries written in a neat, precise hand. Wyoming and Pacific Line, it read. Payroll shipment, August 12, 1855. Paymaster, Elias Vance. The name meant nothing to them, but as she turned the pages, she saw lists of names, towns, and amounts owed. Wages for hundreds of men who had built the very line they now stood upon. She tucked the ledger under her arm and turned her attention to the strongbox. The lock was formidable, but Nell, trained by a man who worked with metal, saw not an obstacle, but another puzzle. It was a tumbler lock, and she could see the faint outline of its internal mechanism through the keyhole. It would be impossible to pick. But there was another way. "The hinges," she said to Jedediah. "They're on the outside." The hinges were thick straps of iron, held in place by heavy rivets. It would be the same work as the door, only finer. For another day they worked, this time with smaller chisels and Nell's own hammer. She directed the placement of the chisel with pinpoint accuracy, shearing the heads off the rivets one by one. Finally, the last rivet head flew off, and the hinge strap came loose. They pried open the heavy lid. Inside, nestled in velvet-lined compartments, were stacks of gold coins. Double eagles, glistening in the lantern light as if they were minted yesterday. It was a fortune. The entire payroll for the Central Division of the railroad. Jedediah stared, his breath catching in his throat. But Nell was looking for something else. Tucked into the ledger she had retrieved was a folded, sealed envelope. On it was written, in the same neat hand, "To whoever finds this." She broke the seal. The letter inside was from Elias Vance, the paymaster. He wrote that on the night of the shipment, the train had been stopped by masked men. But he had grown suspicious. The robbery was too convenient, the location too perfect. He recognized the voice of the lead robber as one of the railroad's own executives. Realizing he was being set up to take the fall for a staged theft, he had locked himself in the baggage car, refusing to open it. In his last hours, as the robbers gave up and decided to abandon the car on a forgotten spur, he used a portable forge and welder from the tool crate, part of the shipment, to seal the door from the inside. His final words were a plea. "The man who orchestrated this is Silas Blackwood, the vice president of land acquisition," he wrote. "He means to use this stolen capital to buy the very land the railroad has made valuable, bankrupting the company and cheating the men who built it. The proof of his scheme is in this ledger, in the discrepancies between the official books and the funds I carry. Do not let this theft stand. See that the men are paid. See that justice is done. My life is forfeit, but the truth must not be." Nell held the letter, her hand trembling. Silas Blackwood, her uncle, the foundation of his fortune, his town, his entire life was built upon this 30-year-old crime, sealed in a tomb with a dead man's integrity. The revelation settled over the small, dusty room in the boarding house not with a shout, but with a heavy, profound silence. Nell, Jedediah, and Martha, the stout, no-nonsense widow who ran the town's de facto community hub from her small, tidy kitchen, sat around a rough-hewn table. The lantern cast a warm, golden light on the open ledger and Elias Vance's final letter. The gold coins remained in the boxcar, a secondary concern to the explosive truth contained in the paymaster's meticulous script. Martha, who had arrived with a pot of strong coffee and a loaf of fresh bread upon hearing the news from Jedediah, read the letter a second time, her lips moving silently. She had been a girl when Caldera Spur had died, but she remembered the stories. She remembered the railroad pulling out, the promises of prosperity turning to dust, the families who had packed up and left with nothing. "Silas Blackwood," she said, her voice filled with a low, simmering anger. "I remember his name. He came through here once before the collapse. A man in a fine suit, promising everyone the moon, said the spur line would make this valley the next Denver." Jedediah nodded, his gnarled fingers tracing the list of names in the ledger. "These men, I knew some of them. Good men. Foremen, engineers, gandy dancers. They were told the payroll was robbed, the company was broke. They were sent away with pennies on the dollar for a season's hard labor." He looked at Nell. "Your uncle didn't just steal money. He stole this town's future." The weight of the discovery was immense. They possessed the evidence to ruin one of the most powerful men in the territory. But as Nell looked at the faces of her new, unlikely allies, she knew a public accusation was not the way. Silas Blackwood had 30 years of entrenched power, lawyers, and influence. A girl with a ledger found in a rusted boxcar would be dismissed, discredited, and destroyed. The truth needed a different kind of weapon. Her father's words came back to her. "You learn to work with the grain, not against it." The grain of this situation was not confrontation, but restoration. "We don't go to the law," Nell said, her voice quiet but firm. "We don't go to the newspapers. We do what Elias Vance asked. We see that the men are paid." Martha and Jedediah looked at her, confused. "Most of these men are dead or gone, girl," Jedediah said gently. "It's been 30 years. "But their families aren't," Nell countered, tapping the ledger. "Vance didn't just record names. He recorded their hometowns. Anson, Kansas, Kearney, Nebraska. Here," she pointed. A foreman, Michael O'Connell, lived right here in Caldera Spur. Martha's eyes widened. The O'Connell place. It's abandoned now. But his granddaughter Elspeth still lives in the valley. She's a seamstress, a widow with 2 boys. A plan began to form, not of vengeance, but of meticulous, undeniable justice. The rebuilding would not be of a house, but of a debt. They would use the gold not as a treasure to be spent, but as a tool of restitution. They would follow the trail laid out in the ledger, find the descendants of the men Blackwood had cheated, and pay them the wages they were owed. Each payment would be a quiet testament to the truth, a seed of Blackwood's undoing planted not in the courts, but in the communities he had impoverished. The work would be slow, painstaking, and powerful. It was a blacksmith's approach to justice, patient, precise, and transformative. The process of settling the 30-year-old debt began the next morning. It was a task that required more than just gold. It required care, dignity, and a deep respect for the past. Nell, with Jedediah at her side for credibility, and Martha for her deep knowledge of the valley's families, made their first visit. They rode a borrowed wagon to a small, weathered cabin on the far side of the valley, where Elspeth O'Connell lived. She was a woman in her 40s, with tired eyes and hands raw from hard work, who greeted them with wary politeness. Nell did not begin with the story of Silas Blackwood or the stolen gold. She began with Elspeth's grandfather. "Mrs. O'Connell," Nell started, her voice gentle, "we're here on behalf of the Wyoming and Pacific Railroad. We've come to settle a debt owed to your grandfather, Michael O'Connell, for his work as foreman in the summer of 1855. She presented the ledger, open to the page where Michael O'Connell's name was clearly written, along with his wages, $180. Elspeth stared at the book, her brow furrowed in confusion. "My grandmother told me the railroad went bankrupt, that the payroll was stolen." "That was the story," Nell said carefully. "But the payroll was not stolen. It was misplaced, and it has now been recovered." She placed a small, heavy canvas bag on the table. Inside, counted out precisely according to the ledger, was the $180 in gold coin, plus a carefully calculated amount for 30 years of interest, a figure Nell had spent half the night computing. "This is what he was owed," Nell said. Elspeth opened the bag, her hands trembling as she stared at the gleaming coins. It was more money than she had seen in her life. It was enough to buy new boots for her sons, to fix her leaky roof, to purchase seed for a spring planting. Tears welled in her eyes, not just for the money, but for the unexpected validation of her family's long-held grievance. "He always said they were cheated," she whispered. "My grandmother died believing it." Before they left, Nell had her sign a receipt, a simple document stating she had received the wages due to Michael O'Connell. It was a crucial part of the plan, another piece of paper to counter Silas Blackwood's empire of paper. News of the payment traveled through the valley, not on the wind, but through quiet, deliberate conversations. A week later, when Nell and Jedediah paid the debt owed to the grandson of a stonemason, the man had already heard the story from Elspeth's cousin. He accepted the money with solemn gratitude and signed the receipt without question. They found others, the daughter of a brakeman, now running a small bakery in a neighboring town, the nephew of a surveyor who had become the local blacksmith. With each payment, the story grew, solidifying from rumor into documented fact. The community of Caldera Spur, long dormant, began to stir. The infusion of capital was like a spring rain on parched ground. The blacksmith bought a new shipment of iron. Elspeth O'Connell hired a man to repair her roof. The general store in the next town over began making deliveries to Caldera Spur again. People began to talk of rebuilding, of reopening the old schoolhouse. Nell Ashby was no longer the strange girl who bought a rusted boxcar. She was the quiet woman who was making things right. She never spoke her uncle's name. She didn't have to. The ledger, the gold, and the growing stack of signed receipts spoke for her, weaving a narrative of truth more powerful than any accusation. Nell's life settled into a new rhythm, dictated by the ledger and the needs of the nascent community. She moved out of the derelict boarding house and into the boxcar itself. With the help of Jedediah and the town's new blacksmith, a young man named Ben whose grandfather's wages Nell had paid, they transformed the iron shell into a home and an office. They cut windows into the thick walls, installed a proper floor over the iron-plated base, and built a small, efficient stove that kept the space warm against the Wyoming winds. The boxcar, once a tomb and a symbol of abandonment, became the functional and symbolic heart of the reborn Caldera Spur. Her desk was a simple plank of pine set on 2 barrels, but on it lay the instruments of her new authority: the paymaster's ledger, a neat stack of signed receipts, and an account book of her own where she tracked every dollar paid out. Her father's small cross-peen hammer sat on a stack of papers, its worn handle a constant grounding presence. She was not a lady of leisure dispensing charity. She was a steward, a position she earned every day. She worked. When the ledger work was done, she helped Martha plant a communal garden, her hands deep in the same dark soil her payments were helping to enrich. She helped Ben at the forge, her old skills returning with a satisfying familiarity as she sharpened plowshares and repaired wagon wheels. People no longer saw her as an outsider. They simply knew her as Nell. Her name was spoken with a quiet respect in the slowly reviving town. Small rituals formed. Every morning, Jedediah would bring her a cup of coffee. Every evening, Martha would send over one of Elspeth's boys with a plate of hot food. The town was becoming a web of these small, reciprocal kindnesses, the true currency of a community. The news of Caldera Spur's revival and the strange story of its benefactor eventually traveled the 100 miles east to Blackwood Station. It arrived not as a formal report, but as whispers among freight haulers and traveling merchants. They spoke of a woman paying 30-year-old railroad debts in gold. They spoke of a ledger. Silas Blackwood heard the whispers, and he understood. He knew whose ledger it was. He knew whose gold it was, but he was trapped. To deny the payments would be to call men like Elias Vance liars. To challenge Nell would be to draw public attention to the very crime he had so carefully buried. He was being undone not by a frontal assault, but by the slow, inexorable pressure of his own history, brought to light by the one person he had so carelessly discarded. His power, built on a foundation of stolen money and paper lies, began to erode. Creditors grew wary, partners grew distant. The empire of paper began to dissolve under the weight of a single, unassailable truth. Nell never saw her uncle again. She heard, months later, that he had sold his bank and his holdings for a fraction of their supposed worth and moved away, disappearing from the territory he had once sought to dominate. He was not defeated in a dramatic confrontation, but simply rendered irrelevant by an act of quiet, persistent integrity. Nell stood in the open doorway of her boxcar home, a mug of coffee warming her hands. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley, and the air was crisp and clean. From where she stood, she could see the signs of life, small but steady. A new roof on the old livery, the wood still pale and smelling of pine. A thread of smoke rising from the chimney of the blacksmith's shop, followed by the faint, rhythmic music of a hammer on steel. 2 children, Elspeth O'Connell's boys, chasing a dog through the sagebrush. This was the world that $4 and a dead man's promise had built. She had not become rich. After the final debt was paid to a distant cousin in Oregon, tracked down through a series of letters, the gold was nearly gone. What remained was not a treasure, but a town, a community, a place to belong. She turned back inside and looked at her desk. The paymaster's ledger lay open, its pages filled with the elegant script of Elias Vance, a man she had never met, but whose quiet courage had become the blueprint for her own life. Next to it sat her father's hammer. She picked it up, the hickory handle a familiar comfort in her palm. It was a tool for building, for shaping, for making things strong and true. Her father had taught her the nature of steel, how to work with its grain to create something useful and lasting. Elias Vance had done the same with his ledger, arranging names and numbers into a tool of unimpeachable truth. And she, in her own way, had taken up their work. She had used the ledger and the gold not to enrich herself, but to forge a community, to mend a 30-year-old break. She thought of Silas Blackwood, a man who saw the world only in columns of profit and loss, who had dismissed her as a valueless asset. He had tried to break her, but like a piece of well-tempered steel she had bent, and then she had held her shape. He had cast her out with nothing, but in doing so he had given her everything. The boxcar, the town, the purpose. She was Nell Ashby. She was 21 years old and had been cast out with $10 to her name. She spent 4 of those dollars on a locked iron box no one wanted, sitting on a forgotten track in the middle of nowhere. It was the best $4 she ever spent. Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet resilience and unexpected justice. The world is full of things that have been overlooked, abandoned, or dismissed as worthless. We hope Nell's story serves as a reminder that sometimes the greatest value is hidden right beneath the surface, waiting for a patient hand and a seeing eye. If you enjoyed our story, please consider sharing it with someone who appreciates the quiet strength of those who build and restore. And for our question today, what is a time in your life when you found unexpected value in something or someone that others had written off? Let us know in the comments. We read everyone. Until next time, stay close.